So hello and welcome to the very first episode of a brand new project of mine, which I'm going to be calling Everyday Landscapes. Now the premise of this project is that I've got a 25-mile radius from my own house in which I can go and find any location and go and take an image. Now each episode will feature just one image, but I will go from the very beginning of finding the image, composing it, taking the shot, all the way through the edit to the final image. Now the reason that I'm doing this is kind of to show you that you don't have to go to the honeypot locations and the big national parks to get images. Now, they might not, well, they certainly are not going to be all, portfolio worthy shots, but it's important that you go out there and hone your skills. And we can't all drive, like for instance myself, it's 2.5 hours to the nearest national park for me, and we can't all do that all the time. So if you can get out locally and you can still get some good shots, imagine what you can do when you do get to these bigger, more grandiose places. Anyway, what am I doing right here, right now? Well, I'm stood in this field, which looks pretty nondescript really, doesn't it? And it's the middle of February, but back in the autumn was where I was very first here doing the very first episode. So let's take you there now and you can see what I managed to get. Today I am just a stone's throw away from my house, just outside a village called Sharpenhoe in Bedfordshire. So what we have is a really in and out day today in terms of the weather. So it's been showery and then with sunny spells, and that gives us some really interesting skies. So we've got a really dark sky at the moment right over the top of this, and there's a lovely little accent just pointing in the top left hand corner where there's a little bit of lighter cloud. So I've just waited a few minutes actually and the skies have cleared somewhat. Now what I'm doing is I'm just going to take some images again with a slightly bluer sky with some more wispy clouds, and I'll have a look at both of those. So let's talk a little bit about the composition here. So essentially we've got this nice tree in the foreground, and then we've got an S-curve that's leading off into the distance with all these trees dotted along the hedge line. We've also got some really interesting leading lines given from where the field has been ploughed previously and the crop's now cut short. And previously we did have a really interesting dark sky. However, that's now been replaced with a much bluer, lighter sky. Now the sun is dipping very quickly over the top of the clappers behind me, or to the side of me here. So I haven't got much light left, but when it was out, it's giving a lovely side light onto these trees, making them look really nice. So basically what I've done here is I've taken two types of shot. I've taken one which is a landscape orientation shot. I'm shooting right out at 24mm. Now it's probably more than I need, 24mm, as you can see on the screen here. There's quite a lot going on, but it means I can crop in to get the actual aspect ratio that I want in post. So I'm using this tree here in the foreground. That will probably be sat on the left-hand third, with the rest of the tree snaking off into the distance, or the tree snaking off into the distance. And the other shot I've taken is a tighter crop in at around about 50mm, but that's actually in portrait orientation, and I've shot a panoramic. So essentially I'm going to get two very similar images, but a panoramic image will have the composition slightly compressed, and also there'll probably be a lot more from left to right in that once I've put it all together, so then I can crop into a much more of a letterbox format, which I think this image might suit. Anyway, let's get it back on the computer at home, do some editing and see what we can do with it. So here we are back at home, and I'm going to edit the image that I chose. Now there were three images to choose from, all very much the same composition but shot in slightly different ways. So the first one was the one I talked about right at the beginning of the video, which had that lovely dark sky and the little light accent, and that was shot at 24mm, and that was a single frame image. And then the second image was one which I took at the end of the video, which was basically a 5-image panorama, and that was shot at 46mm. And strangely enough, the one I actually chose, I didn't really talk about on the video. And that was a 5 image panorama again, but I shot that one at 24mm. And the reason that I've chose this, and you can see on the screen here, is that it's got a really, really interesting cloud formation in the sky. So it's still got a little bit of that accent on the left-hand side that I was talking about with the first image, but the sky on the right, to the right of the tree, is fantastic. It's got a really nice sort of funnel that creates some real interest there in the sky. Now, this is the very first, well, this is the unedited raw essentially. So all I've done to this is just cropped it in slightly, where you can see here where you often get these with panoramics where the edges are not quite right. So I've just cropped it in to avoid those. Now, as you can probably see, if I zoom in a bit, it's got some issues with dust spots. So that was one of the first things that I needed to sort out. And what I'm doing here is I'm going to just show you some snapshots of certain points in this edit. I'm not going to go through the whole edit with you because that would just bore you. So every time there was a significant change, I basically took a snapshot, and that's what I'm going to show you. So what I did first, as you can see here, is I just cropped the image down more to my taste, just to remove some of the sky and some of the very near foreground. So it's in more of a letterbox format. I've done some very basic adjustments, and I've also got rid of all the dust spots. Now you can see on the right hand side here the adjustments that I've made. I'm not going to go through every single one of them because we haven't got time, but if you want to pause the video and just have a look, then that will give you some idea as to how I've edited those basic adjustments. Now, as I mentioned when I was out in the field, the story I felt of this image was this big tree on the left hand side in the foreground, and then the interest as it went through the image with the trees dotted along the hedge line that take you back into the distance. Now, as you can see here with the crop and basic adjustments, you've really lost those trees. You can't really see them, so the story's a little bit lost. So the next stage of the process for me was to try and do something about getting that interest back and pulling those trees out from the background. And I did this by using radial filters. So if I just click onto the next snapshot so you can see here, what I've done is I've lightened up this whole area here with a radial filter. There's actually 3 radial filters. So there's one just here, which has lit up this area. I've also lit up the side of this tree here and lit up the side of the main tree. So basically what I've done here is I've just added some more exposure, and I've also warmed the temperature up, the color temperature up to enhance the feel of a bit of sunlight. Following on from that, the next stage was to then add some more sunlight and some more interest into the foreground of the shot. So if we have a look again back on the screen, you can see here that I've added an awful lot of sunlight here into this foreground. So if we just go back to the one before, you can see it's quite dark. And then if we go to the one where I've added it, so again, it's just a radial filter here, and I've just done exactly the same process. I've added in a little bit of exposure, and I've also added in some temperature. Now, the thing to remember here is you're probably looking at this going, whoa, what, you know, he's going a bit over the top here. But what I tend to do is I tend to do quite strong adjustments and then pull them back later on in the edit. So I can it's almost like I can see where I've been, because if you make very subtle adjustments, sometimes you can't quite work out where you've been. So that there is a very strong edit of what it actually will look like in the end, but it's just so I can see what's going on. The next stage of the process for me was just to add a little bit of emphasis to these grasses here coming in from the left-hand side. So as you can see, I've just lightened those up and I've just pulled those in. So it's almost like you've got, if you look at this image, you've got an awful lot of lead-in lines that are taking you off into the vanishing point, or taking you off essentially into that row of trees in the back, which is kind of what I really want you to see. So I emphasize those lines with the sunlight in the foreground, and by adding a little bit of light down here onto this sort of row of grasses, I've also emphasized that line, which is sort of pulling you in as well. So next it was the turn to just do a little bit of work on that sky. Now, as I said, the reason I picked this image really out of the three is the sky, those clouds, that little funnel. They look absolutely fantastic. So I just wanted to enhance that a little bit. Now, I haven't gone over the top with this. It's quite a subtle adjustment. Now, if I were to just switch on this next snapshot, you'd probably have your attention taken away because I've pulled back some of this detail in the foreground, or some of the light in the foreground. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to zoom in a little bit on the sky, just this little bit here. So when I go to this next stage, you can see, so this is the original here. And then if I just pull that in, you can just probably see, you should be able to see in a second. There you go. It's just popped a little bit. So what I've done is I've just added in a little bit more contrast in here, up the highlights slightly, drop the shadows a tiny bit. I think I might have added a little bit more blue saturation, and maybe drop the luminance on the blue a little bit. I've also added in here a vignette. And then finally, in terms of the Lightroom adjustments, I just decided that I'd just brush a little bit more light into the tree. So essentially what I did is just got an adjustment brush, and the same process really as adding this light in the foreground and along the trees. I just brushed in a little bit of exposure and a little bit of color warmth, and you'll see that here. Now it's really subtle. I have to say it is really very subtle. You probably won't notice a massive difference. But if I just go from where it was previously to where it is now, you should see there's a slight change in the lightness just on some of the trees. So basically that's all I did in terms of Lightroom. And then once I'd finished with the edit in Lightroom, it was then time to go into Photoshop and just remove a few of the distracting elements in the foreground. Now, as you can see on here, we've got quite a few bits and pieces, sort of clumps of grass in the foreground. So there's a little bit there, as you can see, there's this big sort of patch here. There's some bits over there. There's also this dark area in these grasses here, and this little dark bit sort of in here that's quite distracting as well. So what I did is I went into Photoshop and I just used the generative fill effect. And the way that you would do that in this instance is you just select the areas you want to remove, as you normally would, and you just hit generative fill, and instead of typing anything into the prompt, you just leave it blank and then click generate, and then Photoshop does what it thinks it wants you to do, and essentially 99 times out of 100 it does a very good job. So what I'll do is I'll go in full screen here in Lightroom and just show you the before and the after, and you can see what I've done. So here we are in full screen, and this is before any work's been done. And as I said, you can see these quite distracting areas in the image. They're only little things, and you probably wouldn't notice if they weren't there, but they do kind of draw your eye when they are there. So let's have a look at the final one. And there, as you can see, I've just removed those. As you can see, Photoshop's done a really fantastic job of just getting rid of those with a little bit of generative fill. I also just dropped the contrast a little bit on this image and just pull the vibrance up a little tiny bit, and essentially that's your final image. So I hope you enjoyed that episode of Everyday Landscapes. And like I said at the beginning, this really is about you getting out there in your local area and taking shots that, you know, might not be as inspiring as some of the big honeypot locations or the national parks, but it should really help your photography as you're moving along to hone your skills and to, you know, give you a chance of really making the most of when you do go out to these national parks, when you get the opportunity to get some really good shots. Anyway, thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time.